thank you very much. And I'm only standing up because I want to say hello to the people on the far right, or far left if you prefer, of the auditorium. And then are you more far right over there? Or far left? We've got, so look, this is the problem. You'll carry one of these things, possibly two if you're a senior civil servant, just to show off. And into this device is beamed all that information and disinformation. So our overall mission is to deliver information integrity, to allow you and I and our fellow citizens to make good decisions about their lives because they can access reliable and trusted information. And the actual route to that is pretty straightforward. We know over years, and the UK government has issued a proclamation against disinformation, warning the public about disinformation in 1680. Because we have been here before, and ever since the advent of the printing press destroyed the model of communication, one to many, the prince or the priest to the congregation, or the knights of the realm, as long as the printing press, there's always been these darn modern technological innovations that create dissent and disunity and are sources of disinformation. But we are here, as Richard set out at the start, because disinformation through AI is faster, more agile, more able to spread through information networks, and in time, sometimes more realistic than the real thing. The OECD recently reported, indeed last week, they say that 50% of the public struggle to identify disinformation. And just a word about terms. Misinformation is things that are legitimately understood. I'm lucky to have one wonderful wife and two horrible children. And one of the horrible children believed for a long time that Theresa May was a champion skateboarder because she'd seen it on Instagram. This is misinformation, but it's hardly damaging. Last week I was in Bratislava helping our excellent diplomatic team there. And Bratislava is one of those vulnerable countries where real and actual modern AI-generated disinformation is probably having an effect. Certainly on the most recent elections, when the Liberal Party leader and the president of the Slovakian Republic were shown on YouTube advocating all sorts of weird policies and arguing that their fellow citizens should support parties opposite to their own at the election. Real AI-generated fakes. And Google took it down. It took them some hours to do it, but arguably the damage had been done. But I tell you that story about Slovakia because sitting down with our team there and Slovakian ministers and Slovakian journalists, they said, look, AI is the issue, but what is actually happening is that certain parties in the state with close links to the Russian state, close links in some cases to organised crime, are chipping away at the foundations of our democracy, the rule of law, freedom of speech. They engaged in personal attacks. They wind up the conspiracy theorists. Ministers give interviews to conspiracy theorists rather than mainstream media. And AI-generated disinformation flourishes when those pillars of our democracies, be it in Brussels or Bratislava or Berlin or anywhere else, are undermined by those who oppose us. So AI is not necessarily the biggest problem. It is the way this new technology is abused by people that want to undermine the principles, the values that we have as British public servants and indeed are held the world over. Now, it's wonderful that Richard and the Global Government Forum invited me to speak. I don't know why you bothered. In fact, as I walked into the conference centre today, there was a couple of guys talking, and they were wandering in about 11 o'clock, and they said, oh, I'm not sure I was going to come to the second day of the conference today. And his colleague said, well, why was that? He said, oh, there's much worse speakers on the second day. So thank you very much for turning up, unless indeed you are artificially intelligent generated audience. I believe you are real human beings. Are you real human beings? Very good. I know that part. I can see the old, the bold, the expert, the young at heart, the digital, and that's just Tom Reed, the Chief Executive of the Government Digital Service. So I accept you are real, not artificial. But, you know, it's lovely you've dragged me out of my cosy padded Whitehall. For this speech, as a good civil servant, I asked chatbot GPT how we should answer the question. And it is remarkable that it comes up with 7 conclusions: regulation, public-private partnerships, digital literacy, research, international cooperation, ethical AI, and watermarking and traceability, which in a sense are the solutions. And I could talk to you about the Alliance for Information Integrity, or the OECD, or the wonderful, marvelous compact that the brilliant Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden has just signed in Korea at the Global Democracy Summit. The interesting thing is that all the solutions, all the answers to the exam question are things that we know about. Watermarking, public education, partnerships, transparency about how algorithms actually pick the AI that then pops up. And this is really important because a wise person said to me recently, well, the big difference between sort of Google, as we've understood Google search, and modern AI is that Google gave you options, a list of search results, whereas modern AI gives you the answer. And that is where the disinformation can really cut through. I hope those are some conversation starters to get the conversation going, but I will now hand over to someone who's much better looking and much brighter than me, Emran.
Thanks, Alex. What an introduction. Now, because Alex was standing and roving, I have to stand and rove as well, so I'll do my best. So look, I wanted to just complement what Alex has said by talking about a couple of things. I think first is just to emphasize the good side of AI, because I think a lot of these conversations are currently focusing on the dangers and the risks of AI. I just want to say a bit about the good side of AI. And then the second thing is the question is phrased in terms of what can government do on this. And Alex has touched on some of that already. And I think what I want to emphasize is the role that other people have in helping us to do this. Government is not the only actor that cares about the integrity of public information and about the integrity of the public sphere. In fact, happily, there's lots of other people that care about it as well. So I just want to say a word about some of the other people that we're working with and who are working independently on this task. So starting with the first one, we as a government and we as a department are very much taking the view that AI is a transformative technology. It's one of our 5 critical and emerging technologies that we're really focused on as a department and as a government. And that is because of its very wide potential across the economy and across society. And a big part of that potential is that it democratizes, even further than other digital technologies have done, access to information and knowledge and expertise, but also helps in the creation of knowledge and information and expertise, including imagery, including video, including across all modes. That is the transformative power of AI, that it puts that in the hands of all of us as citizens and as users, and there's massive business-to-business applications as well. So that's why it's worth being in this arena. What I mean by that is, if we thought there were not sufficient benefits from AI, then we'd do lots of things to restrict it such that the kind of risk that we're talking about in this session simply would not materialize. But we're not doing those things to shut down the technology or to restrict it very significantly, because the benefits of AI are absolutely massive. So that then takes me to the second thing. How do we act on what these risks are and what these issues are? And how do we do it in concert with other people who share our goals as a government in the way that Alex has described, to protect the integrity of public information and to protect the integrity of the digital public sphere? Let me give you a few examples. Lots of the firms upstream who are responsible for creating AI models really care about this issue as well. They don't want their AI product or service to be used to create dis and misinformation in a widespread way. So those firms are working really hard on watermarking, on identification, and being able to flag when content has been created by an AI versus when it hasn't been. You may have seen some reporting recently about Meta doing work on this in terms of images. Firms that generate video are doing hard work on this as well. You may have seen a couple of weeks ago, OpenAI did some demos of their latest video AI that allows you to create video of up to a minute long. OpenAI are very cited on the fact that being able to create video like that is potentially a massive tool for mis and disinformation. And they're thinking really hard about what's the red teaming, what's the safety testing, what are the user protocols that they need to create to limit that damaging potential. So what we see is lots of these firms thinking about exactly the same issues and wanting to be responsible actors. I think it's our role as government to help them to be responsible actors and to push them on being responsible actors, but we're hearing a lot of encouraging things from the firms themselves about wanting to be responsible actors. And they're not the only ones who want to help us to deal with this problem. There's a really significant set of civil society organizations who also act on this.
Yeah.
You'll have come across services such as Full Fact, for example. These are services who are funded by others, citizens, but also working in partnership with the tech firms, are themselves already very active in helping to tackle mis and disinformation, and are definitely looking at this at the next frontier of what their activity needs to look like. And we're really keen to work with organizations such as that one and others who do this really important work as civil society organizations of protecting the integrity of the public sphere. And then just the third thing I wanted to mention, which I think is a really critical part of this that we talk about less, which is the importance for us as citizens in ourselves being very, very discerning users. I think we do this already, a lot of us. I think we know, for example, when we're on social media, what are the accounts that we really trust and what are the accounts that we know are sometimes engaged in mis and disinformation. I think we have some good skepticism thresholds already built into our user behaviors, but not always, perhaps. And certainly AI, I think, requires that need for skepticism and discrimination even more. So I think the role for us as citizens, supported by the fact-checking organizations, supported by the social media platforms, supported by the tech firms, to help us be the best discerning users that we can be, I think is really important. And one thing we're really thinking about, we do some limited funding at the moment of literacy campaigns, helping especially young people to think quite critically about the public information that they consume, and to help them to discriminate between reliable sources and unreliable sources. I think we're thinking quite hard about what the next stage of that needs to look like in a world in which AI and other things are going to mean there's potentially more of this mis and disinformation around. So I'd be really interested, as you ask your questions, to think about what are the practices that you use as individuals to help you to discern mis and disinformation, and how do we help other people, how do we help all of us to kind of raise our level in terms of doing that stuff? Because we too are an important part of the coalition that is going to help us to protect the integrity of the digital public sphere. Thank you.
Well said.
Great. Thank you, Imran, and thank you, Alex, for those opening remarks. Really interesting, Alex, placing it in the historical context of the invention of the printing press, and that tackling mis and disinformation is not necessarily a new problem. It's one that government has tackled before, and you set out some of the ways that governments can do that, some of the tools that are being invented. I'm sure your recollection of that story with those people outside, it was not fake news, but I will just say the speakers on the second day are just as good as the speakers on the first day, not least because they include Alex and Imran, and indeed myself. Yeah. And Imran's point there about the firms involved in AI development wanting to be responsible actors is an interesting one, and the role for citizens. If I can just use the chair's prerogative briefly before we go to the floor, there's a lot of possible remedies that you both set out there. I was just wondering, is there a particular locus where, for government action, there's going to be lots of partnerships in this, but are there specific areas where it kind of falls to government to be the person responsible for action?
Yeah, and Emran touched on them, and I'm sure he'll want to speak to the internet service providers and the role there. I would say that, in countering disinformation, there are three things you need. You need media literacy, and Emran touched on that. People need to understand what is true and what is false, and they need to be taught that. And campaigns that we've run, like Don't Feed the Beast, if anyone has a time to have a look for Cat Park, another counter-disinformation game that we have developed. So you need that media literacy. You then need an independent media, because unless you have those forces that do shine a light on disinformation, you won't work. And the third part, absolutely, you need government action. My bit as the government communicator is to identify, rebut, tell the story, but the actual work with the major sources of the internet content is, I guess, in Emran's area.
Yeah, so look, let me just pick that up and kind of talk about some of the harder levers that we have, because there are absolutely some things here that we have to use hard levers on. And I'd kind of pick out two examples. One is foreign state interference, kind of bad actors trying to influence the public discourse or trying to influence election outcomes, for example, in the UK. That is something that is a consequence of the Online Safety Act. We have, that is unlawful. That is something we work closely with the social media platforms and the technology companies on. That's quite a hard line for us. That's a really important thing that I think government in particular has got a fundamental role on. And that's at the harder end of where our interventions are. I think the other area that I would kind of just flag on the sort of the harder end of intervention is where AI is being used, or any means are being used, to attack an individual in a way that is just not reasonable to expect that individual, supported however they may be by a tech firm or whoever, anyone else, to be able to counter that. So for example, where AI is being used to generate pornography without an individual's consent, but using that individual's likeness or image, again, that is illegal under the Online Safety Act. That is something absolutely at the hard end of this that we need to deal with through law. So I talked about the coalition building, I talked about the kind of voluntary measures, talked about the kind of stuff that people are doing upstream. That's all really important, but that goes along some stuff at the harder end that is absolutely for government to do, working with law enforcement.
That's really useful, I think, setting out the toolkit there and the different ways that people or different actions government can take. I'm going to stand at the podium to see if I can spot, make sure I spot as broad a range of questioners. Please raise your hand if you have some questions. I'll start at this side of the room. I will come over there later, I promise. Gentleman with a red top and the two ladies there will come to you second. If you go to the gentleman in the red top.
Hi there. Firstly, I thought it was a very good point about making your family aware. So about the AI. So me, my family and friends have a code word. If they ever get a phone call from me and they think it's not me, they know what to ask me. Because there's obviously various software on the phone which can mimic your voice. You talked about measures in place to ensure people don't get swayed by disinformation. But my question is relating the opposite, in the sense that something happens, it's real, but then someone says, well, actually, it's fake, it's not real. How do we ensure that people, don't think something that's real is fake? Something bad happens to a senior member of the pub, someone important, particularly election coming. They do something that's unfavorable, and they say, "Oh wait, it's probably deep fake. It's definitely not me." How do we ensure the reverse, that we're so obsessed with, deep fakes that we don't accidentally make people think that anything real is fake?
Great, thank you. I'll put that question to you both, and then we'll take some more from the audience.
Thank you. And sorry, it was both good questions. On the point of family awareness, we had a session last week with the Singaporean government about fraud and the massive amount of fraud that goes on with people posing and pretending to be things, disinformation and so on. And that is a whole other area of activity, but you're absolutely right to highlight it. On the real and fake, I'm an absolute believer in that if government can provide trusted, reliable, relevant information through gov.uk, through its other communication mechanisms, campaigns that have gone on for many years that teach people. And if there is that trusted source of information that people go to, I think that is the foundation of what we do. There is, in terms of the tragic war in Ukraine, what we have learned from there is the concept of pre-bunking, in that we warned the world that Russia was about to invade Ukraine, and lots of senior people across Europe didn't believe us. But the same principle is true with more general disinformation. If you can highlight what is going on, then you can warn people, and that acts as a defense. And I think there's also a third point. During COVID, we saw lots of disinformation. I mean, the anti-vaxxers went mad, the conspiracy theorists with 5G damaging people's brains through electricity pylons, and a lot more. Much of the disinformation never got beyond a small group of citizens who shared it, and actually us responding to it would have just brought it into the mainstream. So sometimes you leave things well alone. With the anti-vaxxers and the 5G conspiracists, we did intervene using the still quite highly trusted power of government communications to say this is not right. You do need credible people to make that case. It can't always or just be the Prime Minister or senior ministers. You might need all sorts of community influencers to do that.
Yeah, look, I agree with all of that. I think those are all important parts of our toolkit. I think the one that I'd add is, I think what we find is that a lot of the time that fake information is being disseminated, or real information, as per your question, is being contested, a lot of the time when that's happening on social media, it's being done by bots. So it's not being done by actual users. It's being done on a quite industrial scale at times, but through inauthentic behaviors. And those kinds of inauthentic behaviors are actually against the terms and conditions of the social media platforms. So we get a lot of traction when we pick some of that stuff up to talk to the platforms. They monitor for it themselves, and they take some of it down proactively. But they also respond when we flag stuff to them, and then they take it down. So a lot of the amplification of this stuff happens through things that are against the terms and conditions of the platforms too. So I agree with all of the tools that Alex described, but we also have some tools via how social media itself functions.
Yeah.
Great. We had a couple of questions down the front here.
Hi, Heidi from Cabinet Office, GCS. I think everyone's kind of touched on the user behaviors and the responsibility of users in combating mis and disinformation. But just a couple of questions around that. So first of all, how can we as government communicators influence that behavior when the government isn't necessarily always a trusted source for a lot of the people who are absorbing this misinformation? And secondly, when people are often absorbing this information, it's because they want to believe what they're seeing, and how can we combat that?
Yeah, look, excellent points. I mean, the government throughout its time has always understood that you've got to use trusted third parties for what, in a sense, are public health messages. We talk a lot about disinformation, and of course, a lot of it is from foreign states attempting to manipulate the information environment. But actually, it's a public health issue, and that was behind, I think, the first question as well. So, as with COVID, using footballers, celebrities, rabbis, priests, imams, and so on. And that process of education to get people to a place where they understand what's going on. My chatbot GPT analysis said public-private partnerships. And again, Emran has touched on that. And the internet companies are beginning to do more work on this. I think the other point I would say is we always just have to be aware of what is the actual risk. There are some things which we absolutely have to contest around national security, around public health, around following the law. There are other areas. No one will ever convince me that Arsenal Football Club are anything other than the greatest football team on God's earth. That might not be true on every occasion, but you're not going to convince me otherwise. It really doesn't matter. I can exist happily in my emotional bubble. Emran.
Yeah. So I get this challenge a lot from my own mother, as it happens. You may have noticed there's a bit of a Scottish twang in my accent. My mother lives in Glasgow, and she regularly sort of tells me things about, your government wants me to think this. And it's kind of on two levels. One is that I don't trust the government, and the second level is your government, i.e. the UK government, rather than the Scottish government. And I think the only way through that is, I think exactly as Alex is saying, is I think just reiterating the UK government's position. We will always do that anyway, but it's not going to be effective on its own. It's about finding other trusted voices, especially in parts of our society where government is perhaps less trusted, and using those voices or asking those voices to participate in the delivery of what we think are important public messages.
Yeah.
Now, of course, they won't do that for everything.
Yeah.
But I think on so much of what we're talking about and that is critical for the people for citizens to understand when it comes to public health, when it comes to other matters of public importance, there's lots of other people who I think want to help us to carry that message. I think sometimes we don't ask them though. I can probably think of more examples when we haven't asked and sought a coalition than times when we have sought a coalition.
Look, I think that's a hugely important point, and I mean, the question has got me thinking. So the first ever government communications campaign, 16th century, Henry VIII commissioned Thomas Cromwell to change the mind of the public, the English citizens, from being supporters of Catholicism to being supporters of Protestantism. So religion that people have followed for 1,000 years, no good. You've got to support the defender of the faith as the monarch. And the history of this campaign, and I commend anyone who's interested in this, Philip Taylor's book called Munitions of the Mind, it had leaflets and processions and speeches and pamphlets. And there were pamphlets aimed at the general public and there are pamphlets aimed at the intelligentsia. And actually, the model we use hasn't changed that much. Now, a lot of people at the time would have said that was disinformation, and a lot of people paid with their lives for that. But we've been at this for perhaps longer than sometimes we think.
Great. There's a Glaswegian twang in my accent as well, but I also live in Tottenham, so I might contest Alex's point about Arsenal at the same time. Was there a question next to you as well?
There was, and we'll continue with the theme of a Glaswegian accent.
Excellent.
Just to keep it consistent. So my name's Aisha. I'm also from Cabinet Office. This might be a question that's directed more to Imran. So there's a lot of variation across social media companies. So you've got Meta that has more kind of developed policies, and then you've got likes of X and YouTube that are less advanced. And also there's a kind of debate around freedom of expression, and Elon Musk has his own views on what that might be. So I guess from your perspective, how do you create the benchmark across those social media companies with those kind of considerations in mind?
Excellent. That was aimed at I'll let Imran go first, and then Alex can respond.
So no, you're right. They do take different approaches, and it's not my job to kind of advocate for one company over another, but just to sort of give you the context that I have in terms of talking to some of these companies. I think from a lot of the conversations that we have with Google, who are ultimately the kind of the company behind YouTube, I think they would say that, for example, in the context of Israel-Gaza, they've actually been extremely active in terms of moderating content on YouTube, and removed lots of content, or actually even shut down channels on YouTube that were disseminating content that was unacceptable. So I think there's certainly been a move in terms of the video content side. Don't want to just single out Google to get much more activist about this, and they're investing much more in it than they have done at any previous point. And they're all very mindful of the fact that this is a year that has lots of elections in it. Something like 2 billion people are going to the polls over the course of this year. All of the social media companies, all of the tech companies have obviously clocked that. And have kind of sharpened up their practices, have expanded their teams, have expanded their effort on this. There's a lot of discussion going on in the tech firms on this. You mentioned X. I think all I would say about X, and again, it's not my job in any way to advocate for X, but just to kind of illustrate the approach that they take a different approach. Their approach is the community notes approach, which I think is, a kind of, it's a way of going at this that I think is worth thinking about and worth engaging with, which is that it's users themselves who ought to be flagging for other users what content may be problematic or what context may be missing from a piece of content. And then it's other users who then should be able to respond to that. So it's a kind of user-driven thing rather than the platform owning it. Now, you'll have your own view as to whether that's acceptable or not, but that's the approach that X takes. So it's one that very much puts the user at the heart of how the moderation should work.
Yeah.
Oh,
Richard, I think the only thing I would add to Emran's wisdom is that sometimes you give speeches and you know the answers. I do not know the answer. And you talk to a lot of people in this area, say, look, it's developing at a pace, we just don't know how this is going to end and where the responsibilities and rights balance lies. I read in preparation for this the Forum on Information Democracies paper on democratic control of the internet, of the algorithms, of the content that's put out there. That's one solution. It's not the policy of the UK government and so on. But across the world, a lot of people are thinking about more transparency, to get behind the algorithms, to understand how and why content is shared, what content is shared, to try and get rid of the biases and the potential impact that has. But we are still in the foothills of these discussions.
Great, thank you. And just to say, the Forum of Information and Democracy, their Chief Executive and Managing Director, Michael Back, has written for Global Government Forum as well, so you can find an article from him on these exact issues on the Global Government Forum website. I'll go to this side of the hall to see if there's any questions. Anyone can raise their hand. Oh, there's a couple down here. If we want to take them, we can take them one by one. We still have time for that gentleman in the green jump and then the gentleman in the coat next to him.
Hi, thank you. Mark from the Ministry of Justice. I just wanted to pick up on a point Emran made at the end of your opening comments around critical thinking. The pace at which misinformation and disinformation comes out is really quite rapid, and the companies and the bad actors putting it out seem to be always or often feels like they're one step ahead, and they're finding new ways to get that information out. And we talked about the different platforms through which that comes out, which people tend to have a lot of trust in. It's about the point of critical thinking. How do we do more to enable critical thinking? My wife teaches very young children, and even at that age, she says it's really important to start getting them to think about what's real, what's not real, what's true. How do we do more to ensure that as our population is growing and becoming more reliant on sort of digital ways of working, digital media, etc., that we actually ensure they have the right skills to apply critical thinking to what they're looking at?
Do you want to take that first, Emran, and then Alex?
Yeah. So look, I think the key is exactly as you say. I think this is absolutely something to start on in school and to start on as early as possible in school. I think lots of schools are focused on it. I think lots of schools and teachers are looking for more support and more materials to help them to do it. There are some organizations out there who are preparing some of that material and helping schools with it. We as a department, we help to fund some of that stuff. But I think we're definitely interested in seeing what more we can do on that, because I think you're absolutely right. That is so key. And then just to kind of respond a bit more to your point about speed, I think that is dead right. And part of the challenge of AI is not just that it proliferates who can create material, but it also potentially proliferates the speed at which it can be created, or increases the speed at which it can be created. And I think in terms of kind of how we as government react to that, I think that requires us to be really, really slick in terms of the stuff at the hard end that we are actually going to do something about ourselves. And so we're doing a lot of work at the moment in terms of kind of getting ready for the local elections in May, getting ready for whenever a general election is, so that we have a really slick set of processes in government for the things that are at the hard end that we do absolutely want to do something about, so that we can respond at the speed that the content itself is going to spread.
Yeah, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, look, Mark's raised a very good question, and it goes to the heart of the fundamental point about trust. Who do you trust? And basically, we trust people if we think they have our best interests at heart and we are competent at what we do. And that applies to the persona of government as much as it does to every individual in this room. We in my time in government communications these last 12 years, I've been absolutely determined that we use the Civil Service Code, that the government communications is truth well told in public health, in recruitment, in the communications from ministers, and you can all judge how far we have achieved that. But nevertheless, the story we tell as a government and the values that communicates are absolutely key. I agree with you about education. In the Forum for Information and Democracy, there's a lovely line that says, we should do all these things. Oh, by the way, policymakers routinely find these things difficult to implement. So absolutely, we should have media literacy training in our schools and colleges and bring in the internet providers to help do that and make people aware. And I don't think we've gone as far as we should have done on that. Finally, we're talking about AI. I mean, Emran set out why it's a force for good. And actually, in terms of pure government communications, AI does speed up our response. In the dozen years I've worked here, when you go into Cobra, 12 years ago, you'd read out the newspaper headlines to the then Prime Minister, 4 or 5 Prime Ministers ago. Now, on the screen behind me, there is the timely, up-to-date, real-time data with source, type, impact, and volume of information. And that does allow us to make better decisions, as Emran said, at the hard edge of response.
Great, thank you. There was a question next to that gentleman as well.
Hi there. Thanks very much. Really interesting talk, Chris from the Government Legal Department. You can see over the last few decades that information consumption is moving towards smaller and smaller formats. It used to be that you'd have broadsheet newspapers and hour-long news specials on certain issues, and now we're moving towards 6-second YouTube short videos or TikTok. My question is, how do you see communication methods that are more dependent on the long form, like .gov.uk, competing with those vast sources of information?
Look, I think it's a very good question, Chris, and I think government has got to move much faster down this path. And what's changing is something else very subtly. I mean, when I try and explain this to colleagues in government, I say, look, modern communication is about 5 Vs. It's visual, it's largely video, it's done at volume, but it's judged by whether it provides a vision, a piece of hope, and whether it is commensurate with the values of the organisation. And we are still in danger of dad dancing in a lot of our communication. So, we still in the UK government employ press officers, right? And I've been on a bit of a journey to say, look, unless your core government comms officer can produce, edit, publish, and amplify video, they really don't have the skills that they need to be doing their job in the modern world. That is a smaller tactical point, given we've ranged across the AI landscape this afternoon, but you are absolutely right. When I started in my first significant job producing party election broadcasts, they were 15 minutes long. John Major, The Journey. Now you're absolutely right, 6 seconds, and that was basically the time of a lot of the social media content we did during the COVID campaign, where we produced 8,000 pieces of social media content. 6 seconds is the attention span.
Yeah, I think all I'd add to that is we are, I think you're right, consuming much more video and getting much more of our information by video than previously. I think it's probably also true to say that we are also probably consuming more text than we've ever done at our previous point in our history. Like, just when I look at my kids, their consumption and production of text is much larger than mine was at the same age, as is their consumption and production of video. It's their consumption and production of information and content as a whole that is massively expanded. We are probably the most information literate group of human beings who has ever existed. So we are consuming and producing much more information. As a consequence, we are also consuming and producing much more mis and disinformation. But we are fundamentally also consuming more information and producing more information.
Yeah.
And there's massive opportunities that come with that. There's massive democratization potential that comes from that. So we need to watch for the risks and we need to manage the risks. But there's also some really, really exciting developments here.
Yeah, Emran's right about that. The biggest circulating newspaper in the world, might surprise you, it's the Wall Street Journal. And certainly a lot of the big American publications, the New York Times, the Washington Post, are basically websites with legacy newspapers attached. and they still have tremendous cut-through, not just in the America, but in the UK and across Asia.
Excellent, thank you both. Any other questions? I'll put hand right at the back, and then we've got a hand at the front here as well.
Good afternoon. I was wondering if I could ask you specifically about government reaction, and if you're able to tell us anything about sort of the processes you have to identify mis and disinformation, and then how you go about forming a response.
Yes, the short answer to that is available on the Government Communications Service website. It is the Resist Toolkit, which sets out how you analyse the information environment, decide what is harmful and what is just mad folk doing mad stuff, and then how you intervene, depending on whether they are a direct intervention or an intervention through a third party, is going to be the most effective way forward.
Great. You want to comment on that, Imran? Or was that a specific question? Gentleman down the front here.
My question's about if we can use AI against AI. So if AI can create fake videos, can we also use AI in the future to detect those videos and remove them quicker rather than relying on human resource?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some kind of really interesting groundbreaking work going on this. I think it's a bit of an open question at the moment as to when that technology gets to the point where we can be super confident about it. But there are lots of people working on this. I don't want to sort of sound naive about what the risks are that come with AI. There are very significant risks that come with AI, and we're very mindful of what those risks are. You'll have seen that in the UK, we focus really hard on what those risks are. In fact, we convened globally at Bletchley Park last November the first AI safety summit. So we're very focused on what the risks are. But I don't want to downplay how much technological work is going on this within the firms themselves. They're absolutely in this race to see whether AI can help on the detection side as well.
Do you want to comment on that, Alex?
Yeah, the only point I'd add to that is during the major campaigns, the Get Ready for Brexit campaigns, the COVID campaigns, to a lesser extent, Russia-Ukraine, we are using forms of AI to respond, to highlight things where we think it's appropriate. So we are in the foothills of it already, and I think it'll develop as Emran says, but it's got to be guided by a code of ethics and an understanding that there's a human in control, or at least accountable finally, otherwise we will commit the same errors as our adversaries.
Great, thank you. Any other questions in the room? I'm trying to look around. Can you see one? I can't see. Oh, yes, sorry, lady down the front. Down in the front row, Anne, sorry. My eyes are failing me from up here. Hi there.
Hi, Susanna, Department for Environment. You talk quite a lot about education for children and young people. I think from what you've said and some of the examples you've given, there's a lot of mis and disinformation generated from sort of 40 plus people. What education plans do you have to help them, move away from the spread of dis and misinformation when they might have had lower media literacy, in fact, maybe lower literacy as a result of, schooling, etc., and how, because they'll be potentially spreading that misinformation for another 50 years.
Yeah, look, I think that's a very good point. The government has run public health campaigns successfully to stop people, largely prevent them drinking and driving. Largely make them wear safety belts, largely backed by legislation, stop them smoking, and there's more news on that today. So we can educate people into behaviours that keep us and our fellow citizens safe. We're also, I talked about the Resist Toolkit, which is on the Government Communications Service website. We have also a publication called Wall of Beliefs, which looks at how people form their beliefs. And everyone, and the first questioner made this point, we look to our family and our friends and deeply held cultural, religious, tribal beliefs. In the case of football clubs, a couple of people have said they're proud Glaswegians. We've got to be aware about we can intervene in some of those beliefs, but sometimes it is very difficult if they're very strongly held, which is probably why we focus on the younger generation. I agree with you, it is a generational challenge for all generations, and that is where, personally, I think, as Emran said, in this massive election year, it is something where we would have to find the right nudges and shoves across the generations. The idea that your good question, Susanna, has sort of spiked in my head is there's a lot of complaint about VAR in football, ironically, and actually if there was an advertising campaign that basically changed the football results from a Saturday, or the tennis results, or the netball, or anything, or so on, and said, how would you like it if, that might begin to break through some of those, strongly held cultural beliefs about, actually, I could be misled, even in something that I've seen between my eyes, that Arsenal beat Spurs 2-1, which happens a lot. Emran.
It's a good challenge because you don't have the school and you don't have the college and you don't have those institutions through which the kind of the education or the literacy can take place. So I think we have to rely a lot more on civil society organizations more broadly, and we have to rely a lot more on kind of comms campaigns. We're doing some thinking at the moment about what kind of comms campaigns we need to do in what is an election year for the UK, in terms of kind of raising the broader level of awareness about mis and disinformation. And I think exactly as Alex says, running a campaign that draws off information that people are already very interested in consuming, and showing them what some of the risks of mis and disinformation there are, I think is probably the key to how we do that successfully.
Great, thank you both. I'm going to have to draw this session to a close there, but I think that was a fascinating discussion. We're getting the red numbers up here. The next session on this stage is making hybrid working work for all. So please do stay put, because that will too be a very interesting discussion. But the only thing left for me to do is to ask you to thank Alex and Imran for their contributions, and thank you all for attending. Thanks.